Hello and welcome as we get to talk with one of my friends and colleagues, Professor Christian Miller, who spoke to our group as part of Jewish Thought and Jewish Education for the Digital Future. Christian has spoken with us with Sinai and Synapses a couple times before, and he has a new book out called The Honesty Crisis, which is something that we are thinking about over the last few years with the rise of LLMs, with the rise of AI, but also over the last decades as the political discourse has changed, over the last millennia as we think about the ways in which honesty and speech impact our society. Right now, we're moving into the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, which is the celebration of the giving of the Torah, and particularly the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, one of which talks about not bearing false witness, which I think is probably a little bit more nuanced than just what honesty is. But this is a broad discussion of what honesty is, why this is important, how we inculcate it. So I'm really excited, Christian, to talk to you here about your new book.
It's great to see you. Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me back, and let's get right to it.
Let's get right to it, because I think one of the things we need to think about at the beginning is what exactly is honesty and why is that important in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a philosopher. I like to start there. I want to be clear about what I mean and make sure we're all on the same page. And so let me bypass an easy answer. An easy answer would be just to say honesty is telling the truth, dishonesty is lying, and we're done. And that's that there's something to that. Of course, our cultural icons are associated with truth telling. Pinocchio is associated with lying, but it's much more rich, much more nuanced, much more complicated than that. So honesty, I'm thinking of as a virtue, as a character trait, as part of who we are as a moral person. It makes us better, morally speaking. It has an outward component, behaviorally, has an internal component, motivationally. It has a cross-situational aspect or dimension to it. What does that mean? An honest person is honest in the courtroom, on the podcast, at the office, in their home life, in their religious life. So consistently across situations, stably over time, 1 week, next week, next week. It's not just that they take a day off or they take a week off. So there's those components to it. Let's pause and unpack both the behavior a little bit more and then the motivation. So on the behavior side, truth telling is important, but honesty also prevents things like cheating, stealing, fraud, BSing, hypocrisy, self-deception, misleading. It covers a lot of moral territory. So in fact, maybe more than any other virtue out there, it prevents lots of different ways of acting badly. Yet even that's not enough, because you can act a certain way outwardly and not qualify as virtuous if your heart isn't in the right place, if your motives aren't virtuous. So you could tell the truth to the boss, and you're telling the truth. So no fault as far as the behavior is concerned, but you might be doing it just to try and angle for a promotion, or to get a new job, or to not get fired from your existing job, or to get rewards in the afterlife, or to not feel guilty. All these kind of are for impression management reasons, to make yourself look good, virtue signal, all this kind of thing. All that's no good in my view. No good as far as virtue is concerned. They're all self-centered. They're all about benefiting myself. And a virtuous motivation has to be other directed, out of myself, looking not just to benefit myself, but looking to something larger. What might that be? Well, we could unpack this in quite some detail, but I'll give the really brief version. It could be either I'm concerned with the good of another person. So I'm telling the truth because I care about the other person, because I love the other person, because they're my friend, because I want what's good for them. Or it could be because it's the right thing to do. So more abstract, dutiful, obligatory motivation, because I have an obligation to do it, because I've been commanded to do it, because it's my moral duty to tell the truth. these kinds of reasons, whether the abstract or the personal, but not my person, the other person, these are perfectly fine. These are good motives for honesty. They're virtuous. And so if you put all the pieces together, you got the motivation in the right place, you've got the behavior of the right kinds, stable over time, consistent across situations. Now we have a much richer picture of what an honest person will look like.
So I want to play something in, which is a question of trust and trustworthiness. And
Mm.
in Judaism, for example, there's a relationship of the word emet, which means truth, and emunah, which means sort of trustworthiness. And they're linked and they're related, but there's an aspect of not only saying the truth, but being a trustworthy person. So
Mhm.
where does that come in of honesty and truth and trustworthiness?
Sure, sure, sure. So they got three pieces here. Uh, let's take them slowly one at a time. So honesty and trust clearly are related, but not the same thing. So they're not interchangeable, but they are conceptually and also empirically linked. So if you're honest with someone, that's going to foster trust with that person. If you're dishonest and it's discovered, of course, if it's not discovered, that's different. But if it's discovered that you're dishonest towards the other person, that's going to break trust. The trust is founded upon the other person knowing and trusting that they're getting you as you authentically are. They're getting your authentic self, not some mask or performance or curated version of you that's different from who you really are. Now, all this though doesn't have to translate into truth with a capital T. Truth as an objective truth, truth as in the way reality really is. There's an interesting thing about honesty, which is that honesty tracks subjective truth. It does not track automatically objective truth. To make that less abstract, here's an example I'd like to use. 5,000 years ago, if you ask people what the shape of the Earth is, they would say the Earth is flat. They're being honest. They're giving you an authentic communication of as to what they genuinely believe, and of course they're mistaken. So you can have honesty and you can have trust in that kind of situation without the actual truth, and you can have the actual truth without honesty and trust. So to illustrate that, you might have someone today who is a member of the Flat Earth Society, which is a real thing. But of course, it's costly to be a member of the Flat Earth Society, and they might not want that to be well known. So they might be asked, what is the shape of the Earth? And they say, the Earth is round. Everyone knows that. Well, they're saying something that's true, but they're not being honest, and are not. If it's discovered, they're going to, break trust because they're not authentically reporting what they really do believe. So those are some ideas about how those concepts relate.
So there's a verse in Leviticus in the Holiness Code in Kiddushim in Leviticus 19, where there's a line that says you shouldn't put a stumbling block before the blind, which on some level, like, don't be a cruel jerk and do that. But the rabbis take that to mean of don't mislead somebody, that if somebody is blind to other information. There's another part that says like having honest weights and measures as well. So it's like a lot of what you're talking about is not necessarily finding objective, quote unquote, scientific truth, but more building a social truth that's there.
Good. Although, so a couple comments, a couple reactions. Although, note that on this perspective about honesty, it's compatible with being an honest person that you are radically mistaken about the facts, whether scientific or otherwise. You could be raised in a very isolated way and be, wholly ignorant of many things that ordinary people are aware of, and yet still be an honest person. Because when asked, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? You tell the truth as you see it, even though that's not the truth as it really is. Second reaction, misleading is an interesting category. because misleading adds a kind of a nuance to how we think about truth and honesty and dishonesty. Um, if you mislead someone, and we're careful, we're talking about misleading as opposed to lying, as opposed to BSing, as opposed to these other things. What you're doing is actually telling them something true as you see it. So you're not lying. You're telling the truth as you see it, but in a curated way to try and get them to draw a false conclusion. So an illustration of that is, you're married. You next day after a night out, your wife asks you, "What were you doing last night?" And you say, "Oh, I was at the bar with the guys." Now that is true, and you believe that's true. You were with the guys last night. You just left out a crucial word on purpose. Only. So you're saying something true, but you're hoping that your wife will draw the false implication that that's the only place you were last night. Whereas, in fact, you went to the bar, but also went somewhere else afterwards. So up to no good. So misleading is an interesting category because you are speaking the truth, but in a curated way, with the hope, with the intention, with the aim of getting the person to draw a false conclusion. That is also dishonest. And so we need to be mindful of that and not do that if we really want to be honest people.
I want to play off a little of what you're talking about because one thing that we've been thinking about with Sinai and Synapses is the role of AI and technology. And
Hmm.
you use the word speaking. And I think one of the things that has become very interesting and challenging in our world right now, which is the movement from speech to written language
Hmm.
to video to moving in this. People talk about a post-literate society right now. One of the things about honesty, to me, I feel of honesty is something that is generally much more interpersonal and spoken more than written text. I think written text, that's a lot of interpretation from whether that's legal, whether that's moral, whether that's religious. When I think of honesty, I I think of that more as something that is spoken because written text you can look back and say, you use that word only, and you can parse that.
Uh,
Uh, where does that come in?
yeah.
I'm thinking both in terms of the role that technology plays in religion of written text that's there, and what exists in our digital society and AI generated society.
So I think you're right that that's where our mind goes first when it comes to honesty. We think of interpersonal verbal communication. Very natural. That also is connected to the idea of lying being the kind of first thing we think of as oppositional to honesty. Having said that, I am very intentional in not limiting or fencing in honesty just to interpersonal verbal communication. I think it can manifest in lots of other ways. Um, so there's communication with myself. So it doesn't have to be interpersonal, it can be intrapersonal. I can fail, to be honest, if I deceive myself. So that there's that. I also think that there can be acts like a car dealer, used car salesman who paints over a rusty spot on a used car to hide it when trying to make a sale. That's something dishonest. There's no verbal communication there. Uh, the written case, I also think honesty comes into play. But again, I'm agreeing with you. That's not where our minds go to first. Uh, so here's one way: plagiarism. So if I write an article and in that article I take ideas from someone else and their publications and I incorporate them into my article, but I don't cite them, I don't give them credit as the source of those ideas. I take credit for it myself. I publish my article. Then I'm engaging in plagiarism. Plagiarism is a form of dishonesty. It's also wrong. Now all this gets I think, accelerated, and this takes us to the honesty crisis when we introduce technology, and because technology is just going to magnify these effects sometimes exponentially. So we can go in a variety of directions, like student AI cheating. That's going to be written typically using AI, doing something dishonest as a form of cheating. But you alluded to things like videos and audio. So maybe we'll start there. So deepfakes are another thing I talk about in the book. And what's going on here is, someone's creating using AI and let's say a deepfake audio of a voice that sounds just like a real person's voice. Say, I'm thinking of an example that happened in the last political election. Biden's voice was AI generated during the primaries to sound just like Biden's actual voice. It was used for a robocall for voters, Democratic primary voters, and the voice said, "Don't bother showing up for the primary. We don't need you now. We need you in the general election." So that I think the creation and distribution of that audio deepfake was dishonest. It was misrepresenting intentionally the actual facts because Biden never said that. He never said those words. They were artificial. Same thing happens with these videos. The most prevalent or most common form of these videos are non-consensual deepfake pornographic videos. I won't go into the details of what those look like, but you take a celebrity's face, typically a woman, transpose it onto a pornographic actress's body, doing the usual pornographic stuff, and then these days with the technology, it looks so realistic. It looks as if it was actually that actress doing that thing. There are thousands of these videos out there now. They are non-consensual. They are pornographic. They are deepfakes. They're AI generated, and they're dishonest. Because after all, this person never made it. And they're dishonest in multiple ways. They never consented to making them. They never were actually in those positions. They never were with that other person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it turns out then that deepfake videos are also dishonest as well.
You know, it's making me think. There's a line in the Talmud that says that they talk about lashon hara, which is the Hebrew word that literally means the evil tongue. It's often described as gossip, but I think it's a little bit more than that because people say you can say lashon hara even if it's true, right? There's an evil, and so there's a question of that lashon hara is kills three people. That it kills the person who says it, the person about whom it is said, and the person who hears it. And the rabbis say that actually the person who gets it the worst is actually the person who hears it, because once you hear something, our brains are such that we assume that something is true, and it becomes harder to be able to move away from that basic statement, which I think is both now orally and visually as well. And I think the question of non-consent, that's a huge part of this. Yes, there's elements of pornography, but there's also the broader conversations of manipulation. There was one a couple of years ago where there was an AI generated video in response to Kanye West's anti-Semitic ad on the Super Bowl, and they created videos there that nobody agreed to. And that I think that's become a huge challenge as well. But when you hear something, we evolved to be able to just sort of believe people. And so how do we live in a world where we always have to have our skepticism radar, but that's also exhausting, and it's also hard for our society to always be saying, no, I can't trust that anymore.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm going to reaffirm what you said in the chapter 2 of the book. I talk about some empirical research on lying. And what emerges from that research is not a kind of really pessimistic story that we lie all the time. It's a story where we're both truth default speakers and also truth biased in what we hear. So, and then I'll take it more directly to your question. So the kind of emerging theory here in communications research and psychological research is that we default into telling the truth to others. That's called truth default theory. That's our natural tendency. and we're also truth biased. So our default is to assume that other people are telling us the truth, and or that our communication that we receive from others is honest. And it, building on what you said, it takes resources, psychological resources, to overcome that default tendency. So it's a costly thing to have to do that. Now, are we getting closer and closer to having to do that because of things like deepfake videos and audio? I don't think we're there yet. I think it's still reasonable a lot of the time when we go online to trust the validity and honesty of what we're seeing and what we're hearing. But there's no doubt that it's less trustworthy than it was before AI, and that every year that goes by is becoming less and less trustworthy as well. So I think we could imagine a future where, because we've been let down so many times and betrayed so many times by this, what we're seeing, we are now skeptical. Our default stance becomes one of skepticism. Is not, oh yeah, that's fake. It's we don't know. There's importantly different stances. It may be fake, it may be real. I can't tell anymore, so I can't default trust this anymore. And so that is going to have pernicious consequences. Take things like criminal trials. Audio and video evidence is extremely powerful in criminal prosecution. Can we trust it anymore? Um, you know, so when we lose that ability to trust these things, it becomes unclear what information sources we're going to be able to rely on. And are we therefore going to be fostering even greater ignorance and losing a lot of our cultural heritage in the process, because we can no longer naturally trust these forms of communication? That has me worried for sure.
Yeah, I think that's and we also have the questions with rise of LLMs. And one of the things that's interesting is I often have started to teach this a little bit, where I ask people, which is more intimate, and I mean this just sort of a social intimate, have a face-to-face conversation with a person or texting back and forth. And everyone always says, of course, like talking face to face. I said, great. Which feels more intimate to you, texting back and forth with an LLM or texting back and forth with like a video that's there? And everybody always says going back and forth with an LLM. Like people feel more connected because an LLM is more personal and there's a back and forth. A video is a one-to-many. An LLM is an interpersonal
Right,
element.
right,
And
right.
so there's the deepfake videos that's almost designed to be propaganda, I think,
Yeah,
in a lot of ways.
fair enough.
An LLM is not trying to be deceptive. It's not trying to be propaganda. And often it's relatively accurate, but it does hallucinate. It does raise questions of, is this accurate or not? I mean, we all talk about the joke. Someone said, I started talking about in Claude speak with my wife, where my wife will say, did you empty the dishwasher? Yes, I did. Well, why are they still dirty? I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you for calling me out. I was not being accurate there and honest. So, because that's how these LLMs, like, they will say, here's what's happening, and then push it, and it's not honest. So where does that come into education, coming into relationships there as well?
Since it's easier for me to head in the direction of education since I'm a professor. I teach at Wake Forest. I have to deal with this issue on a constant basis in my classes. I'm thinking about, I have to assess my students with grade assessments. I can do things in class, but as a philosophy professor for decades, I've been giving them papers to write at home and then turn in. Other professors will have problem sets. Other professors will have coding assignments. We're all, kind of default used to giving at-home grade assessments. Well, the students now are default AI communicators, like you just talked about. Starting in high school, they're using this every day. They're quite comfortable bringing an assessment from a professor to the AI and having the AI help them do it or do it entirely for them and then turn in the work. Most of the professors will not condone this, but if a professor does condone it and it says that's fine, okay, well then there's no question of honesty here. They're just doing what the professor allows. They turn it in, they get their grade. We're all fine. Well, at least as far as honesty is concerned, I think maybe other respects we're not fine. But majority of professors are not going to be happy with this. Majority of professors want the thinking and the reasoning and the consideration and the reflection and all the other things that come with the assessment to be done by the actual students. And then instead, the student is offloading it onto this other tool, this device, that's doing it for them and then turning it in and often getting a better grade than they would have gotten otherwise. So what I make of this is if the professor expects the student to do the work, if the student doesn't do the work and has the AI do it for them and turns it in without acknowledging the contribution of the AI, then that is plagiarism. This is not the traditional form of plagiarism, but it is a form of plagiarism. You're taking credit for someone or something else's work and putting it forward as if it were your own. So you're misrepresenting on purpose who's doing the work. And without acknowledging the source and giving credit to the source, this is not only plagiarism, it's dishonest, and it's, I think, morally wrong. Now, that's the kind of doom and gloom version of it. It's just descriptively accurate. That's what's happening today. What do you do about it? Well, there are the optimists and then there are the pessimists here. The pessimists are going to be me, and the optimists are going to say, well, maybe there's a way to incentivize them students not to use this. Maybe there's a way to, honor code could be effective and reining in their temptation to use it, or maybe we have harsher penalties to incentivize a negative direction, them not doing it. We could talk about all that. I think those ideas were good in the earlier years, in the past, when we didn't have technology at all like this, or even we had the internet and we had Google. Even then, I think some of these techniques were effective. But now I think it's hopeless, sadly. But I don't see any way around it. The technology is so easy to use. It's either free or very cheap. It's lightning fast. It's going to deliver an output. If you're skilled at using it, it's going to deliver an output that's better than what you would have written yourself. And as of now, it's largely undetectable at least at a bar that would be needed for prosecution by the university. So when you throw in all those elements together, I would love it if students had a better character that they could resist all that. But heck, we're human beings. We're not virtuous for the most part. That's a lot to ask of students to pull back from a resource like that. And so as a pessimist, I think the only thing to do moving forward is to take the AI out of the students' hands, take it away from them. And how do you do that? Well, you have all of your grade assessments done in class where you can regulate what they do and they can't use AI.
Well, and, as you're bringing up these questions of putting it on us to be able to act, or the students to be able to act, that one of the values of religion and rules is being able to sort of cognitively offload potentially, which we look down on. We don't want AI to be doing our cognitive offload, but sometimes being able to say, this is how we act in this world of you don't have to make this decision each way. I mean, in our society, everyone makes their own decisions. We live in for those of us who are living in North America and the West, there is a level of individualism. Mm-hmm. But as we're moving into Shavuot, which is a holiday that talks about the giving of the Torah of rules, at least in Judaism, that this is not what Judaism says. In Judaism, there's a joke that says God so loved the world that he gave us his only Torah. That's which is a play off of what Christians say. But the Torah is viewed as an expression of love, and in the same way in which a parent teaches children by saying what's right and wrong, and here's how we act, and helping them develop and grow as human beings,
Mhm.
and not having to make each individual decision. That's a lot of what Judaism and Shavuot and the Torah are about as well. That they're they're designed to be able um, to guide who we are. And actually, one of the things on Shavuot is the giving of the Ten Commandments. And we can, there's obviously a lot of discussion in our American society about the value of putting them up in public schools. I think it's not a valuable piece to be able to put that there. And a lot of the rules themselves are not as valuable as other ones in the Torah. But there's a professor named Joel Hoffman who said that one of the things that is really unique about at least the Ten Commandments is that they don't have a consequence. They are simply, this is what you should do. Every other rule, at least in anywhere, like, if you're working with at Wake Forest, for example, there's a rule, like, if you use an LLM, here is what's going to happen. If you
Okay.
violate this policy, here's
Right.
what the consequence is. Wake Forest is not just going to say, like, be a decent human being. Like, there's no
Right.
way to regulate that. And so trying to have both the the rules, but also what are the values to be aspirational. And I wonder about honesty, that there's something of being honest. There's a value. There's a consequence if you're not honest,
Mhm.
and
Right.
there's also the being honest just for the fact of being honest.
Good. 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 Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, and very, very rich. So I am a big supporter of morality, moral rules, moral principles, moral guidelines. Um, you know, they're helping us. I don't think we offload our thinking onto them, wherever they're coming from, whether it's Ten Commandments or something else. They're a very useful, helpful tool to have, but they don't do our moral thinking for us. They have to be interpreted. Each one has to be interpreted. We also have to make sure we recognize when they apply and when they don't. We also have to think about how to adjudicate conflicts between them. If they come into conflict between them, which one do we prioritize? So there's a lot of value to this, but not in a way that makes me worry that we're just like in the LLM case, we're just kind of offloading our thinking onto something else that does it for us. Still, plenty of opportunity to richly make our own contribution. Second thought, when it comes to the Ten Commandments specifically, interesting point. Circling back to honesty, I think of at least three of them having to do with honesty. So there's the one where the false witness one, but one of them has to do with adultery. One of them has to do with stealing. So here, I think with my broad conception of honesty, I want to include under the tent of honesty, not stealing, not committing adultery, as well as not lying or misleading other people. So arguably, of any virtue that connects to the Ten Commandments, honesty might do it the most. At least as far as like on a crude numbers count here. Third point, I never appreciated the idea about the consequences. I never thought about that before. There's no like immediate threat of punishment associated with violating them, or immediate promise of reward associated with satisfying them. And that I like that idea. I never appreciated that, and that also makes me feel better from a virtue perspective, because a real danger when it comes to moral principles, religious or not, is that we follow them or motivated to follow them just on, again, the self-interested grounds. Because if I don't, I'm going to get punished in some way, and if I do, I'm going to get rewarded, and it makes it all about me and my benefits and rewards. That's not going to be virtuous. We have to move beyond that. And then that dovetails with the last point, which was what you highlighted as far as aspirational. And I'm a big fan of exemplars and moral saints and heroes, people who are doing better than me. and can be role models for me to follow. But I think the same point can translate over to what you're talking about here. And these are aspirational principles to follow too. I can, in both cases, whether it's principles or persons, I can admire them. I can be inspired to follow them because I recognize I'm not doing a great job, but I can be emotionally moved to change my life to have it conform more to either the principles of the person. And that can then foster a process of character improvement and development. I'm not virtuous myself, but I can work on myself, maybe with the help of my community, religious community, for example, maybe and with the help of examples and principles to try and nudge my character closer and closer to where it's supposed to be, following these principles, living a life like this exemplar. So I think there's a lot in what you said and resonated with me.
It's I mean, it's a wonderful way to close this. I mean, of being able to think through of how do we build not just our individual deepening of honesty, but how do we build a society that
Mhm.
values honesty? And I think it's becoming harder and harder to do that. And I think
Yeah,
that's not something that we can do purely as individuals, but how do we create a culture where this is something that is celebrated and valued?
yeah,
So I would love you as a last thought of how do we create that culture of honesty in our world right now?
yeah, yeah. And I wish I had a simple answer for that. I wish I had a magic formula that would that would sell a lot more copies of my book, for example. But there is no such easy answer as everyone would expect me to say that there isn't. There are a few things we can say, though. I mean, we can say them at least in a general level. They have to be implemented constructively and concretely in real world situations. I mean, it would be nice, first of all, if people at the top, just piggybacking what we were just talking about, people at the top were exemplifying this virtue. That would therefore inspire everyone else in the society or culture or institution to follow. That has been found time and time again to have a kind of trickle down effect on people in a group. If the leaders are doing it, that can inspire others to do it as well. Sadly, though, that's going to be an obstacle, in many contexts. I think politically, that's going to be an obstacle. Sadly, many organizations today, the same thing we see, like CEO scandal after CEO scandal after CEO scandal. So you can't just rely on that. Second thought is you hope to find like-minded people in your organization and at least be intentional about it with them in conversation, such that you're clear that this is what you care about. They also care about it, and you're going to keep each other accountable together. It may just be a few people, but accountability groups can be quite impactful. Because if left to our own devices, we will often rationalize, we'll find ways to cut corners. We'll say, oh, it's not a big deal, or who's never going to find out? It's not going to hurt anyone. But accountability partners can really keep us honest, and we keep them honest. So that's two things. And then the third thing would be ethical reminders in the society or the organization or the group. So some kind of tangible way to keep us on track and not get us distracted or misled or caught up in our own self-interest. So, some places like educational places have actual signage on their walls, or they have an honor code, or they have, alma mater, or kind of built into, like, for Wake Forest, it's pro humanitate. It's our motto. But it could be weekly reminders to the group over email, or a reading group, or a discussion group, or a lunch group, or this kind of thing. Just keeping our perspective where it needs to be, and having that be habitual and regular and repeated, and not just a one-off. A one-off will fade. It needs to be sustained. So those are some initial ideas.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that's the question of how we build this society and groups, and because honesty is both personal and interpersonal. So, Christian, thank you for taking some time to talk with us here today. And your book, you can get your book anywhere books are sold, of the honesty crisis, and I hope that we are able to start building out a little bit more of a world of honesty as we start to feel the walls closing in around us. How do we make sure that we keep our world structured and together? So thank you,
Yeah.
Christian,
Thank you.
for
That's why I wrote the book. So I'd appreciate the opportunity to share some of the ideas. Great to see you.
thank you so much.